Some movies get remembered the way audiences first met them, and that's the end of the story. Others have a buried version of themselves underneath, an earlier draft, a different cast, a different ending, a tone the audience never actually saw. Pretty Woman is the second kind. The polished romantic comedy that played in theaters in 1990 grew out of a script with a different name and a much darker direction, and almost every layer of it was reshaped on the way to the version that became one of the era's defining films. Here are 24 secrets the picture quietly carries inside it, starting with the one that rewrites what kind of story it nearly was. Number 1. 3000 was a different film. The romantic comedy that audiences hold up as the defining Hollywood fairy tale of its era didn't start anywhere near a fairy tale. It grew out of something almost unrecognizable. Before it became Pretty Woman, the screenplay carried a different name. J.F. Lawton wrote his original under the title 3000, the sum Vivian was paid for her week with Edward. Lawton's first version played as a hard urban drama, not a romance. The tone was harsher, the world rougher, and the ending sat far closer to the bleak side of what such a week would actually look like for someone in Vivian's position. The studio sweetness audiences eventually responded to wasn't anywhere on the page. Much of the recognizable architecture was nevertheless already in place. The opera sequence existed in the early draft. The boutique humiliation existed. The shape of Vivian and Edward's 7 days, the rhythm of their negotiation, even a number of the most quoted exchanges all lived inside the colder script first. They survived a long rewriting process that softened nearly every surface around them, while the spine remained intact. The bones of the film audience's love were laid down in a story almost no one from that audience would have wanted to sit through, and the journey from that script to this one shapes nearly everything else still ahead. Number 2. The Lotus almost wasn't there. Edward's white sports car cuts a low, sharp silhouette through the early morning Beverly Hills shots, and within seconds, the audience knows everything they need to know about him. Money, speed, detachment. The car does in a frame what a paragraph of dialogue would have to do otherwise. That car almost wasn't a Lotus. According to reporting around the production, the more obvious choices the brand's American audiences would immediately associate with the upper end of luxury, backed away from the project once they read what kind of film they were attaching themselves to. Pretty Woman's subject matter, especially in its earlier and harsher phase, made the safer luxury brands hesitant to put their badge on Edward's hood. The Lotus Esprit slid into the gap by being available when the more conservative options weren't. The decision read at the time as a fallback. It looks now like one of the production's small accidental masterstrokes. The Esprit's profile is sharper and stranger than a Mercedes or a Jaguar would have been, and that strangeness gave Edward's first few minutes on screen a slightly off, slightly out of place quality that fit the character better than the obvious choices ever could have. A piece of marketing reluctance ended up writing some of the film's visual personality. Number 3. Her first rule was no nudity. Julia Roberts arrived on the production with a clear line drawn around her own work. She would not perform nude scenes. The decision was hers, made early and held to, and it shaped how every revealing moment in the film would eventually be shot. The practical solution was a body double. Shelley Michelle stood in for the more exposed material inside the film itself, allowing those scenes to play with the visual information the script needed without crossing the line Roberts had set. The arrangement was unfussy, the kind of working compromise that disappears from a finished film when it's done well. A viewer paying attention to character has no reason to register it at all. The context around that line matters. Roberts was 21 when production began. She had only just started turning into the kind of star she would soon become, and she was holding a position about her own image at a moment when the industry would not necessarily have rewarded resistance. The boundary held anyway. The fairy tale that grew up around the picture was built on top of it, not in spite of it, and the choice she made before her first day on set quietly shaped a career still ahead of her. Number 4. Disney rebuilt the tone. There's a small confusion that often gets passed around about how Pretty Woman ended up softer than its origin, the assumption that the studio fought to preserve the harder version and was somehow overruled. The chronology runs the other way. J.F. Lawton's grittier 3000 draft existed before Disney's Touchstone label took the project on, and the studio's choice to develop it at all was a choice to commercialize it. Once the project sat inside the slate, the push moved firmly towards something accessible, a romantic fairy tale tuned to broad audiences, rather than a hard urban drama tuned to none of them. That repositioning was the studio's contribution and the studio's call, and it set the direction the rest of the production carried out. The next layer of reshaping, the warmer texture, and the actual emotional reading of the central pair came from somewhere else, and the production wasn't finished tuning the picture yet. Number 5. The leads were nearly different. 4 actors. That's how many other names sit on the public record of who was attached to, considered for, or reportedly approached about the two leads of Pretty Woman before the casting finally settled. Al Pacino circled the part eventually played by Richard Gere. Burt Reynolds and Sean Connery were each in the conversation around the same role at different points. Michelle Pfeiffer's name is among those that have been raised in connection with Vivian. Each of those alternate worlds points toward a noticeably different film. Pacino or Connery in Edward's chair would have pulled the picture closer to the colder original. Pfeiffer and Vivian would have changed the chemistry's whole frequency. A different kind of warmth, a different kind of vulnerability, a different shape of the laugh that ends up doing so much of the film's emotional work. The version that reached audiences turned out to depend on a casting outcome that came together later than anyone outside the production probably realized. Number 6. Julia's note closed the deal. Please say yes. Those are the 3 words that closed the deal. Written on a small note Julia Roberts slid across the table to Richard Gere during one of the early meetings about the project. He had not yet committed. Garry Marshall was working hard on him, lining up the arguments, but the script in Gere's hands, closer at that point to Lawton's 3000 than to the eventual romantic comedy, wasn't an easy sell to a leading man with quieter, more deliberate instincts. Roberts came into the meeting with no particular plan beyond the note. The way Gere has told the story since, the gesture did more for the project than any of the formal pitching around the room. Gere has also said openly that he hadn't yet figured out who Edward was. The character on the page didn't fit him cleanly, and the fuller sense of the role only arrived later through the work itself and the conversations with Marshall that followed. The casting that became the film's emotional center came together less from a leading man's certainty than from a young co-star willing to ask plainly for what she wanted, and a director willing to wait while his lead caught up to the part. Number 7. Roberts studied real lives. In the months before Pretty Woman went into production, Julia Roberts spent time inside a Los Angeles free clinic where Garry Marshall's wife, Barbara, volunteered. The clinic worked with women whose lives intersected the world the script had drawn so carefully around its margins. Roberts wasn't there to research a costume or pick up a behavior to perform. She listened. She talked with the women who came through. The film's idea of who Vivian was, how she carried herself when she wasn't switched on for a client, what her boundaries were, what she might know about the people around her that no one else in the story did, was being assembled out of those conversations rather than imagined into being. The script itself nudged in that direction in places. The brief, almost quiet moment in which safer sex practices show up reads as one of the production's small tells, a deliberate choice to keep at least one foot in something true while the rest of the film was being lifted into its glossy register. The result is a Vivian whose charm has weight under it. The sparkle and the timing got the attention, but the reason the character holds up across rewatches is the work that happened before any cameras were on her. Number 8. Marshall made it a fairy tale. There's a strangeness in how Pretty Woman lands tonally that doesn't come from the script as written. It comes from a director with one foot deliberately in the fairy tale tradition. Garry Marshall took the framing further than the studio direction had asked for. He read Vivian as a kind of contemporary princess in a tower, treating the hotel suite as the tower, the elevator as the climb, and Edward's arrival as the version of the story where the prince has his own emotional rescuing left to do. He read Barney, the hotel manager, as something close to a fairy godmother, the figure who helps the princess become recognizable. None of this was on the page in 3000. None of it would have survived a less generous director. Marshall wasn't ignoring the harder material underneath, he was looking through it for the shape of a different story. Where the studio repositioning set the destination, this layer of work was about which path the picture took to get there, and the path was the one Gere would have to find a way to walk without making Edward's stillness read as cold. Number 9. Gere had to find Edward. On the page, Edward Lewis didn't quite work. The script had the surface of him, the mergers and acquisitions career, the cold habit of buying companies just to break them up, the suit and the suite, but the interior was almost blank. The performance had to be built somewhere in that gap. Gere has said in retrospect that he was figuring out who Edward was as the production went on, and that Garry Marshall's direction was a kind of permission to do less rather than more. The instruction Gere has described in the simplest version of it was to stay still, don't reach, don't perform. Let Edward be a man whose rules for himself are mostly about not letting other people see what he's actually doing. The push-pull rhythm with Vivian, her warmth meeting his restraint, her openness pulling against his closed posture, became the load-bearing dynamic for the romance precisely because Edward refused to do the work for her. The choice paid off in a particular way. The reason audiences end up rooting for Edward at all lives in the stillness and the listening, rather than in any of the bigger gestures most films would have leaned on instead. Whether the role could have come together that way with anyone else directing is a question the production never ended up needing to answer. Number 10. Two doubles built the illusion. For decades, viewers have argued about whose body actually appears on the iconic Pretty Woman poster. The cropped torso in the cutout dress, the legs, the angles. The answer turns out to involve not one body double, but two, and they did entirely different jobs. The promotional image audiences memorized was a composite. Donna Scoggins supplied the body and the legs. Julia Roberts' face was placed onto the final image during post-production, producing the version that ran on every poster sleeve and display reel for years. The poster was a manufactured object, not a candid frame from the film at all. Inside the picture itself, the credit goes to a different person. Shelley Michelle stood in for Roberts in scenes calling for more revealing material, working within the boundary Roberts had set against doing nudity herself. Two women, two distinct functions, and one surprisingly long-running confusion about which of them did what. The image audiences associate most strongly with the picture turns out to be a face on someone else's body, and the body in the bathtub belongs to a third party again. Number 11. Costumes built the fantasy. The red dress moves first. Long velvet sleeves, deep neckline, the gloves to the elbow, the diamond at the throat. Vivian on the Way to the Opera is the moment Pretty Woman stops being a comedy of class and starts being a fairy tale about transformation, and the costume does most of that work before any line of dialogue lands. Costume designer Marilyn Vance built that look, and many of the others in the film with the kind of conviction that survived studio resistance. The red opera gown almost wasn't red. Vance fought for the choice over alternatives the production discussed and almost defaulted to, and she has been clear in interviews afterward that the color was the point, the boldest possible visual signal that Vivian had crossed into a world she wasn't supposed to belong in. The design tracked her arc. Early in the picture, the costumes are loud and exaggerated, deliberately uncomfortable to look at. The boutique day moves her towards something cleaner. The polo match places her in something carefully off-key, neither wrong enough to fail nor right enough to belong. The opera moment lands her in the gown that says she has arrived even if she hasn't. What Vance accomplished is closer to character writing than to wardrobe. The way Vivian carries herself across the picture changes more visibly through clothing than through almost any other element of the production, which is why the costume work has become its own piece of the film's legacy. The red opera gown alone has lasted as one of the single most recognizable garments in romantic comedy history, and the recognition belongs to the designer who fought for it. Number 12. The piano scene wrote itself. He asked me what I do in hotel rooms alone at night, and I told him I play piano when I can't sleep. Richard Gere's account of how the piano scene ended up in the film comes back, in retelling after retelling, to that single exchange with Garry Marshall. The scene didn't exist in the script when the conversation happened. Marshall took the answer back to the writers almost immediately. The scene was added. The music Edward plays in the lobby in the middle of the night is Gere's own improvisation rather than a piece chosen and rehearsed in advance. The actor pulling something genuine out of his own life and the camera finding it. That's why the moment works the way it does. The music isn't trying to do anything except sit with Edward, and the way Vivian comes to him under the piano belongs to a different register than nearly anything else in the picture. One of the most quoted romantic beats in the film exists because the director asked an honest question and trusted the answer instead of fitting it back to a pre-existing shape. Number 13. The necklace laugh was real. On the set, Garry Marshall snapped the lid of the velvet jewelry box shut on Julia Roberts' fingers as she reached for the necklace inside. The startle and the laugh that followed weren't in the script, weren't rehearsed, and hadn't been Roberts' plan at all. The take ran, and the laugh audiences have remembered for decades is the genuine reaction of an actress whose director chose to surprise her on camera rather than ask her to perform surprise. What that small jewelry box beat does in the film is broader than the gag itself. It briefly turns luxury comic, lets Vivian be the one in the room responding most honestly to it, and lands the richest object in the scene as the funniest one. Marshall had a habit of building moments out of accidents he set up himself, and the necklace snap is the cleanest example of that habit the picture has. Number 14. Deleted scenes changed Vivian. There's a version of Pretty Woman audiences have never quite seen, not because it was lost, but because the editing of the theatrical cut quietly trimmed away pieces of it. Several scenes that survived rough drafts and even shooting didn't make it into the final film, and the picture audiences got is meaningfully softer than the one that came out of production. The cuts pulled in the same direction. Rougher beats edged toward comfort, sharper edges sanded down, moments emphasizing the precariousness of Vivian's life trimmed in favor of beats that emphasized her transformation. Some of the energy from Lawton's earlier drafts had survived all the way through to Daly's and only got fully extinguished in the cutting room. The decision wasn't about hiding the harder material so much as protecting the tone the studio and Marshall had been moving the picture toward across every other stage. It leaves an open question behind. Pretty Woman as we know it is the version that prioritized warmth over weight. Whether that was the right call, whether a version with more of Vivian's edges still showing would have endured the way the softer cut has, is the kind of question only future restorations could ever genuinely settle. Number 15. The opera mirrors Vivian. The lights go down, the curtain rises, and the opera Vivian is watching is La Traviata, Verdi's adaptation of a Dumas story about a Parisian courtesan who falls in love with a young aristocrat and is forced to give him up because of the gulf between her world and his. She doesn't know the plot when she sits down. By the time the third act lands, she's crying. The choice of opera is doing more work in the film than a glamorous date scene needs to do. La Traviata isn't just any tragic opera, it's specifically the one whose central woman is in the same situation Vivian is. Both stories follow a woman trying to cross a class line through love. Both involve a man who must decide whether his world's rules matter more to him than the woman in front of him. Both have a moment when the woman has to grapple with the fact that being chosen by someone from above isn't the same as being allowed to belong there. Vivian's tears are not a generic reaction to a sad opera. The film is showing the audience that Vivian recognizes herself on the stage, in the body of a courtesan whose love story ends badly because the world doesn't yet have room for it. What the picture does with that recognition is its own move. Pretty Woman, unlike La Traviata, gives its protagonist the ending the opera withholds. The opera scene becomes a mirror Vivian briefly looks into and then chooses to step away from rather than accept. The film tips its hand here about what kind of fairy tale it wants to be, one that knows the older story it's playing against, names it explicitly, and then quietly insists this version doesn't have to end the way the older one did. From there, the picture's fantasy is being built deliberately, frame by frame and location by location. Number 16. The Hotel Sold the Dream. On Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills, the Beverly Wilshire, already one of the city's grand hotels by the time production began, became the visible center of the film. Edward's suite, the lobby, the hallways, the front entrance with its valet stand, all anchored the picture in a real and recognizable Los Angeles. The hotel did half of what the script needed selling done for it. Pretty Woman is a fairy tale set in a real city, and the choice to film inside an actual landmark rather than build the fantasy from sets gave the romance a kind of grounded glamour that an entirely fabricated luxury hotel couldn't have produced on its own. Some interiors were recreated, some scenes were enhanced or reshaped on stages, but the public-facing places audiences see most often are the hotel itself. Walking past the front of the Beverly Wilshire after the film came out felt, for a long time, like walking past a piece of the romance the picture had created. The afterlife of that decision is its own measure of how successful the placemaking turned out to be. The Beverly Wilshire became part of the film's mythology, the kind of location people travel to specifically because of the movie. The hotel sold the dream so completely that audiences keep buying the ticket decades later. Number 17. One line became an Easter egg. It happens all the time. The line Pretty Woman gives to its waiter after he catches a flying escargot mid-air during the formal dinner scene has become one of the film's most quietly memorable beats. Garry Marshall liked the joke enough that he found a way to repeat it more than a decade later with the same actor. In The Princess Diaries, the same waiter delivers a slightly different version of the moment after a glass shatters at the table, and the gag relands in a film aimed at an entirely different audience. The reference isn't a wink at the original escargot, it's a returning actor and a returning rhythm, slightly modified for the new context. Marshall's habit of carrying small details from one of his films into the next gave audiences a kind of running shared joke nobody had to be in on to enjoy. The escargot moment is the cleanest example of that cross-film bookkeeping, and the only reason it works in both films is that the line itself is gentle enough to fit either room. Number 18. Marshall cast his favorites. Look closely at the credits and at the character actors filling out the smaller roles in Pretty Woman, and a pattern emerges that doesn't show up in most studio productions of the era. The same names keep recurring, and several of them share Garry Marshall's last one. Scott Marshall, the director's son, appears in the film. So does Tracy Reiner, his niece. Beyond family, the supporting cast leans heavily on actors Marshall had been working with for years and would keep working with afterward. Hector Elizondo plays Barney, the hotel manager, and the warmth between him and Roberts on screen comes partly from the fact that Marshall and Elizondo were a long-running creative partnership by the time the film was made. The texture of the picture's smaller roles, the relaxed, lived-in feel of nearly every secondary scene, comes from a director surrounding himself with a familiar circle and letting them work on instinct. The result is a movie that feels less like a piece of anonymous studio product than the bigger budget would suggest. Marshall's productions tended to feel like extended family workshops, and that quality is one of the things audiences responded to without necessarily knowing why. The picture trusted its margins because the people occupying them were already trusted. Number 19. Hank Azaria was hidden there. During the scene where the police step into Edward's hotel suite, the detective on screen has the kind of face that makes a modern viewer pause and rewind. It's Hank Azaria, several years before the voice work and the roles that would make him broadly recognizable across an entirely different corner of the industry. The credit slips past in a few minutes of screen time, and the part itself doesn't ask much of him beyond the brief professional weight a detective scene needs to carry. Pretty Woman keeps producing small recognitions like this for any audience watching 20 or 30 years later. Azaria isn't a planted Easter egg or a flagged appearance. He's an actor who happened to be cast in a small part in a major film at the start of a career that would later make every credit before the breakthrough feel like a hidden picture. Looking for him on a rewatch is the kind of small thrill the film didn't have to offer, but ended up giving anyway. Number 20. Ralph Bellamy's Final Bow. In Hollywood in 1990, Ralph Bellamy stepped onto the Pretty Woman set for what would turn out to be his last performance in front of a camera. He was 86. He had been working in pictures for nearly 6 decades by that point, going back to the early sound era. Leads, character parts, an Oscar nomination, a long career in television, the kind of resume that doesn't really get built anymore. He plays James Morse, the older industrialist Edward's company is preparing to dismantle. The role is small in screen time and disproportionately heavy in what it asks of the audience. Morse is the figure who reminds Edward of who he might still become if he stops mistaking acquisition for accomplishment, and Bellamy plays him with the kind of unhurried decency that lets the character do that work without needing the script to underline it. Watching the scenes between Morse and Edward now, knowing this was the last time Bellamy would ever step into a part on a film set, the weight settles in differently. The dignity of the performance reads as personal. The exchange between an old craftsman and a young one isn't only what the script says it is. There isn't really an outcome to put on this. Bellamy died not long after the film opened, in 1991, and the part stands as the close of a working life that began before color was standard and ended in a glossy romantic comedy directed by Garry Marshall. The picture doesn't draw attention to it. It doesn't have to. Number 21. The soundtrack sold the dream. 2 songs did most of the heavy lifting on the soundtrack, and either one alone would have been enough to brand the film for a generation. Roy Orbison's Oh Pretty Woman gives the picture its title, its strut, and the rhythm under Vivian's reinvention montage on Rodeo Drive. Roxette's It Must Have Been Love gives it the emotional pop anthem audiences carried out of the theater and onto the radio for years afterward. The Orbison song earns the title sequenced twice. It's the source of the name itself, chosen partly because of the song, and it scores the moment Vivian moves through the boutiques, transforming herself one window at a time. The choice to anchor the picture's most fashion-forward sequence to a 1964 song from a country-tinged rock and roll legend reads now as obvious because it works. But at the time, it was the kind of cross-era pairing that could have read as awkward or off-tone. Instead, the song's swagger gave the sequence its confidence and the audience its permission to enjoy the spectacle. The Roxette track does a different job. It floats over the romantic, emotional through-line of the film, lifting the more vulnerable scenes into a register the dialogue alone couldn't reach. Together, the 2 songs gave the soundtrack a double identity, the strut and the swoon, and audiences responded to both. The film became, almost from its first weekend, as much a sound as a story. Number 22. Critics split, Roberts won. On paper, the critical reception of Pretty Woman should have hurt the film. Reviews were genuinely divided. Some praised the warmth and the chemistry, others attacked the fantasy directly, arguing the picture sanded over a difficult reality and rewarded its hero too easily. The film didn't escape that argument. It sat squarely inside it. What audiences and the industry registered, separately from the critical conversation, was the performance at the center. Julia Roberts was doing something on screen that hadn't been happening in romantic comedy at that scale for a long time. Her warmth, her timing, the vulnerability she allowed the camera to see, and the way her presence pulled the audience into her corner regardless of what the script around her was philosophically up to, all of it added up to a star performance the more skeptical reviews couldn't really argue against. The Oscar nomination for Best Actress and the Golden Globe win for the role both followed. That gap between the film as an object of critical disagreement and Roberts as a performance that simply landed became one of the defining facts of her early career. The disagreement about the picture has never quite resolved. The verdict on her in it has never seriously been in doubt, and the years since have only confirmed the original audience read more strongly than the original critical one. Number 23. Box office changed everything. The gap between what Pretty Woman cost and what it eventually made is large enough that the film effectively reshaped its own genre's economics for the decade that followed. Romantic comedies didn't usually do this. Mid-budget pictures didn't usually do this. Garry Marshall productions, well regarded as they were, didn't usually do this. The numbers tell the story plainly. The film was made for roughly $14 million. By the end of its theatrical run, it had earned around $463 million worldwide. That ratio, a return well above 30 times the production budget, is the kind of result studios spend a decade trying to engineer and rarely produce. The picture did it on what looked going in like a modest commercial bet. It wasn't an event film. It wasn't a sequel or an adaptation of pre-sold material. It was a romantic comedy starring an actress who was just becoming a star and a leading man whose previous decade had produced respectable rather than blockbuster results. What the result actually changed was the industry's read on Roberts. The film made her, in a way, few performances have ever made an actor that quickly. The next several years of her career, the speed with which she became one of the small handful of leads who could open a film on her name alone, was set in motion the weekend the picture crossed past expectations and kept going. Studios noticed, producers noticed, other actresses' representation noticed. Pretty Woman wasn't only a hit, it was a recalibration of what a romantic comedy could be financially, and a launchpad for one of the most durable star careers in modern Hollywood. The economics of the result still shape how the genre gets greenlit 30 years later, and the projects that came after spent years trying to recreate the alchemy of a small-budget meeting, a star turn before the star was technically a star yet. Number 24. The musical kept it alive. On Broadway in the late 2000s, the curtain went up on Pretty Woman, the musical, a stage adaptation that brought the film's story to a different medium nearly 30 years after its theatrical release. The musical took its songs in a different direction, with Bryan Adams and Jim Vallance writing original material rather than relying entirely on the film's iconic soundtrack, and it reshaped the staging for live theater rather than trying to literally reproduce a movie. What the existence of the musical implicitly says about the source is its own kind of secret. Films get adapted to the stage all the time, and most of those adaptations come and go without leaving much trace. Pretty Woman as a musical found audiences in New York, then in London on the West End, then on touring productions that have continued running. The story turned out to be portable. The fairy tale held its shape even when the original cast, the original songs, the original director, and the original aesthetic were all stripped away and replaced. The picture became something rare in the process, not just a hit film but a reusable narrative, a fairy tale, and a brand audiences kept showing up for in different forms. The story works on a Broadway stage for the same reason it worked on screen. The bones underneath the polish are sound, and the longing it puts at the center is one audiences never seem to tire of meeting again. Pretty Woman has held up the way it has because it manages to be two things at once: a romantic fairy tale that recalibrated an entire genre's economics and a heavily reshaped object, drafted from a harsher script, repositioned by a studio, softened by a director dressed into character by a designer who fought for the choices that made Vivian readable, and performed by two leads whose pairing nearly didn't happen. The fantasy works because the work underneath it was real. The reach has only widened since. The fashion still gets imitated, the hotel still draws visitors, the songs still play, the musical still tours, and the romantic comedy template the film set running still echoes in nearly every new entry the genre produces. If you got something out of this, the like and subscribe buttons help every video find the audiences these stories deserve. And if a single one of these secrets reshaped how you see the movie, drop it in the comments below. The strangest pieces of any production almost always become someone else's favorite.